Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Worlds. September 6, 2003. We all carry whole worlds in our heads, whole worlds in our bodies. I once saw a cartoon of a meditator being taken over by her thoughts. In the first panel, she's sitting very quietly. Then the word think appears in her head. Then another think gets added onto her neck, and then another one in her chest, and finally, by the end of the cartoon, the words think blot out her entire body. That's the way it is with us. Our bodies are filled with thoughts. We ordinarily think of thoughts as filling the mind, but they also take place in the body as well. The mind is what does the thinking, but parts of the body get involved in the process. This is how we carry those whole worlds around. You sit here with your body, and all of a sudden it turns into someplace else. It's all happening right here in the mind and body in the present moment, but in the course of the process the body and mind get turned into another world and another time. You can compare it to the control keys on computer keyboards. If you ordinarily push a P or a Q, you get a P or a Q on the screen. But if you push the control button and then push the P or the Q, they're not P's and Q's anymore. You get something else. The machine prints or it quits. All of a sudden the key does something else, for it's in a different context. The same with the mind and the body in the present moment. You press your inner control key and all of a sudden you've got another world. It's not just the body sitting here breathing. It's Thailand or Europe, New York or Texas. In addition to the worlds we intentionally carry around, there are also lots of unintentional ones that come blowing through our minds. Those come because of the force of our old actions. As those storms come blowing through, sometimes the best thing you can do is simply hold on to the breath. Just as you would batten down for a storm, you just lie low and try to hold tight to the breath for dear life as the winds blow through. You hang on to the breath as tenaciously as you can. Even though it doesn't fill your awareness, it at least gives you a corner where you're still in the context of the present moment. In the discourse on the establishing of mindfulness, you're told at the first stage to subdue greed and distress with regard to the world. Vinayalokabhijadumanasam. In other words, you may not be able to stop these various worlds from happening in the present moment, but you can work at subduing any greed or distress with regard to them as they come through. In other words, try to be as equanimous as possible, as uninvolved as possible in the process. Stay with the breath as much as you consciously can. As you keep this up, after a while the storms begin to calm down. Then, if you're holding on to the breath consistently enough, you can begin to see things a bit more precisely. You see more and more how much you're conspiring with those various worlds coming in. But the initial principle is that whatever conscious decisions you're making, make sure they're decisions to stay with the breath. At the very least, don't get involved in other things that come along, even if they're filling your body and mind. This helps establish a beachhead in the present. Without that beachhead you simply get blown around. Even though this standpoint may ultimately be a fabrication, it's a useful one. In the beginning you hardly notice that it's a fabrication. You just notice that it's a place where you stand still, where you take your stance and try to stay as solid as possible, as uninvolved as possible, so that your frame of reference doesn't shift, so that you don't find yourself suddenly in Las Vegas or Pattaya. You're right here. Those other worlds are coming through, but they're coming through right here. And you do your best, even though you may get involved a little bit, to make sure you feel no greed or distress with regard to the worlds coming through. In other words, you don't get involved with any narratives that would pull you in even further. You don't let these things get you upset. Sometimes this requires just standing still with the breath. Other times it requires reflecting on those various worlds. What do they give you? What do they hold for you? How real are they? There's a passage where Rathapala is talking to a king who wants to know why Rathapala ordained. After all, his family is wealthy, his parents are still alive, he himself is young and healthy. Why would anyone who's not obviously suffering want to ordain? Rathapala says he considered that all worlds are swept away, they don't endure. That's his way of expressing the principle of inconstancy and impermanence. They offer no shelter, there's no one in charge. No one can protect you from the suffering of those worlds. That's the principle of stress and pain. The world has nothing of its own, one has to pass on, leaving everything behind. That's the principle of not self. There's nothing you can really hold on to in any of these worlds. No matter how much you grasp at them, they just slip right through your fingers like water. Finally, all worlds are insufficient, insatiable, a slave to craving. No matter how good they get, they're still not good enough for the mind. Once the mind develops a sense of desire for these things, it's never fulfilled. The Dhammapada contains a verse where the Buddha says that even if it rained gold coins, we still wouldn't have enough for our sensual desires, because all the things they could buy keep slipping away. They're impermanent, unstable, stressful, not self. They offer no real protection, nothing you can really hold on to. Reflecting on this makes it easier to let go of these worlds as they come roaring through. If you sense any temptation to get ensnared in a particular world, if it seems interesting or intriguing, just reflect on this. No matter how good it gets, it's never good enough. At the same time, it can cause a lot of suffering, not only for you, but also for the people around you. You sit here with a mind capable of creating these worlds, but they require a body as their staging ground. And just keeping this human body alive. Think of how much other people have to suffer so that you have enough food, shelter, clothing, and medicine to keep going. And then what do? You use this body to entertain yourself as a staging ground for your private worlds. How selfish and thoughtless can you get? So these worlds that you're building not only on your own suffering, but also on the suffering of others. When you think about this, it sets you wondering. Can you develop the skill where you don't have to build these worlds and still be happy? Can you find a happiness that doesn't depend on the body? The first step, as I just said, is learning how not to get involved in the worlds coming through the mind. Try to establish this frame of reference right here, at the body in and of itself. Even though the breath might not fill all your awareness right from the very beginning, even though these various worlds may keep barging in, you at least lay claim to a corner of your awareness and hold on. The basic principle is that you don't get involved with anything else but the breath. You just stay right here. Then, as you stay here with more consistency, you find that this frame of reference begins to fill more of your awareness. This in and of itself frame of reference becomes more and more predominant as you develop an interest in the breath. It's not just a matter of in and out. There are all kinds of variations in the flow of breath energy coursing through the body. As you explore them, you find that you're learning not only about the breath, but also about the mind. You begin to see the mind a lot more clearly as you're staying with the breath, and you get more absorbed in this frame of reference. Body, feelings, mind, and mental qualities in and of themselves, all present right here at the breath. This is what helps keep you anchored. More and more, this fills your awareness. When the body fills your awareness and your awareness fills the body without all those other worlds coming in, when you finally get a sense of seclusion where you're not involved in those things, that's when you can settle down in right concentration. This gives you a stronger and stronger frame of reference right here. Then you look into the process where this frame of reference gets switched. What's the control key that turns a simple P into a print command? What's the switch in your frame of reference that turns the process of fabrication in the body and mind into another world? You have to be quick to catch these things as they happen. The more quickly you notice this process of fabrication before it starts forming a world, when it's just a little stirring in the mind, the better. Here the first step is learning simply how to notice it and dissolve it away. Notice it and dissolve it away. Make it your sport. As soon as there's any stirring that could turn into a world, as soon as you're aware of it's happening, just zap it. Breathe right through it. Release whatever tension there may be around it, in whatever part of the body it may show itself, because whenever a thought shows itself in the mind, there's going to be a corresponding tension in the body. When you're consistently with the breath, you can see this clearly. And you keep zapping that tension with the breath to dissolve it away, zapping it to dissolve it away. It's like shooting rubber ducks in an arcade. Nothing really gets harmed. They're not real ducks that you're shooting. Just try to get really good as a marksman. The Buddha compares this to someone who's really good at firing arrows, who can pierce great masses, and can fire arrows in rapid succession. In other words, once you gain a sense of being established in the body in and of itself, or in feelings in and of themselves, you want to shoot down the process of fabrication as quickly as you can. As soon as it switches from the in and of itself to another frame of reference, shoot it down. Gradually you get quicker and quicker, and you begin to see more and more how you've been involved in the process. There are points where you make a decision. Am I going to let what I've got here shift into another frame of reference? And there's that curiosity. What's this thought going to do? What's that thought going to do? You're always hoping for something to provide satisfaction, to provide entertainment, but if you keep in mind the fact that these things never can provide enough satisfaction, no matter how great a world they create, you can just shoot them down. There's the example that Rathapala gave of the king who controls a really large prosperous territory. Word comes that there's another territory to the east that he could conquer and rule as well. So he sends troops to conquer it. Then he's told of another territory to the west. If he wants, he could probably send over his army and defeat that one, too. So he goes over to the west and just keeps expanding his territory until he's got everything east, west, north, south on this side of the ocean. Then someone tells his of another territory that he could conquer on the other side of the ocean, so he decides to go ahead and do that. That's the way it is with the mind. There's never a sense of enough. These worlds we create never provide satisfaction. When you reflect on that, it's easier to give yourself over to the process of shooting them down. Any distraction that comes up and could disturb your concentration, just shoot it down as soon as you realize it's happening. The breath is very useful in this process. As your awareness begins to fill the body, you get more and more sensitive to obscure places in the body, where thoughts can land on the body or take different sensations in the body as their basis. The more completely your frame of reference fills the body, the more quickly you can see these things. You can shoot them down, and then you begin to see. What are the raw materials that these worlds are created from? Well, there's not much. Just a little stirring here, a stirring there, and you connect them up. You stitch them together. To what purpose, to what end? You begin to realize that there's nothing there of any real satisfaction. The worlds you create offer no satisfaction. The things you create them from are all very ephemeral. They offer nothing really solid that you can hold on to. It's like building a house out of frozen meat. It's bound to melt and start stinking up the place. Realizing this gets you more and more firmly established in your frames of reference in the present. The body in and of itself, feelings, mind, mental qualities, all in and of themselves. Before these things can turn into anything more elaborate, you keep them really cleared out, as uncomplicated as possible. Ultimately your gaze will turn on the basic building blocks themselves. Even this present frame of reference. That's a kind of becoming, too. There's an element of fabrication, an element of creation in here as well. But before you start taking this apart, you've got to get it really solid as a basis for taking other, more obvious things apart. Most people, when they practice, are in too much of a hurry. They get a little bit of concentration, and they say, okay, the next step is discernment. So they abandon their concentration and destroy it before it's really had a chance to do It's work. We like to figure things out too much in advance. After all, we think we're clever. It would take less energy, take less time if we could move on as fast as possible. But some things you just can't rush. The analogy the Buddha gives is of a woman who's pregnant. She asks her husband to take a monkey and dye it, so that when the child is born, it will have a little monkey to play with. The husband wants to know what color to dye it, depending on whether it's a boy or a girl, so the wife tears open her womb right there, and of course that kills the child. Some things you can't rush. The same with training the mind. You've got to get it really solidly established, really centered here on the breath. Don't worry about the next step, where it's going to go. When you settle down with the breath, you do need to remember that this is not the ultimate, it's just a temporary resting spot, but at the same time you need to try to make it as good and as comfortable as possible, as solid as possible. Only then can it provide you with a framework from which you can see other things that are subtle and refined. Try to inhabit this world as continuously as you can, the world of the present moment, the world where things are kept simple. Body in and of itself, feelings in and of themselves, mind in and of itself, mental qualities in and of themselves, before they get turned into something else with the control key that transforms your frame of reference. Keep this frame of reference as consistent as possible, so that you can see the other movements of the mind, understand how they happen, how things come about, how they arise, stay, how they pass away. Try to keep this spot as solid as possible so you can see those other subtle movements in the mind. That, you find, will cut away a lot of the suffering that goes along with those things. Without this solid foundation, you just get swept away. The world gets swept away, you get swept away along with it. The world offers no shelter, you've lost your shelter here in the present moment. These worlds have nothing of their own, well, you have nothing of your own in the present moment, because you keep destroying it, abandoning your frame of reference, to go running after shadows. These worlds are a slave to craving, you're the slave. So do your best to establish a good solid state right here in the present moment, at whatever level you can manage, whether it's simply the level of not getting involved in greed and sorrow for the worlds that come blowing through your mind, or the level of being more and more independent from them. Ultimately, you want to get to the point where you're totally independent of any world. Anasato viharadina circa kinsi lokapadiyati, as they say in the Satipatthana Sutta. You dwell independent, not attached to anything in the world. That's the direction you want to go, where you're not attached to any world at all. So, whether it's simply the level of withstanding the worlds that seem to be totally beyond your control, or you're getting more and more sovereign and independent, whatever level you're at, do your best to stay as solid as possible, as uninvolved as possible. Don't get upset because you're not totally uninvolved. Work at whatever level you find yourself, because the work of the practice does build on your earlier, more faltering steps to make something more solid and secure. It's a path where you can make progress, even if it's just step by step. A lot of people say, I don't want that. I want sudden awakening. Well, some things can happen suddenly, but no understanding, no skill comes with sudden things that happen haphazardly in the mind. We're working on a skill here, the skill of learning to stay centered, keeping this frame of reference, not shifting to others. Just that skill in and of itself can cut through a lot of suffering. So as you meditate, try to keep your nose down. Try to keep as close to the ground as possible. As always, the people who stay close to the ground are the ones who don't get blown away. The people who keep their nose down get to sniff interesting things, get to find out interesting things that everybody else tends to overlook. Contemplation of the body. March 1st, 2004. People have a lot of resistance to contemplating the body as a topic of meditation. Some of them complain they already have a negative body image, so why focus on the negative side of the body? Others say that body contemplation is a way of fostering aversion to the body, which is an unhealthy mental state. Others say they're not all that attached to their bodies, so why should they have to focus on the body? Or they'll refer to that story where the Buddha recommended contemplation of the body to some monks, and then went off into the forest for a couple of months. The monks got so disgusted with their bodies that they started committing suicide, while others hired assassins to kill themselves off. When the Buddha came out of the forest, he found the community of monks was a lot smaller than it had been before, so he called the remaining monks together and told them to practice breath meditation instead. Some people cite this as proof that contemplation of the body is an unhealthy practice. However, the fact that people resist this meditation so much shows that it's important. It's threatening, for it gets right to the core of our attachment. There's nothing in the world we're attached to more than our own bodies. That's why people have so many excuses for not focusing right here. If you don't focus right here, what's going to happen? You're going to maintain your deep attachment to the body. It's not going to go away on its own. Some people think they can short-circuit the process of attachment by going straight to their sense of self, thinking that by cutting out the sense of self, they won't have to work on contemplation of the body, because the work they're doing goes deeper, straight to the root. But attachment is like a vine. You can't find the root until you take hold of the nearest branch and trace it back. You can't really get to the root of your attachment to self until you've looked at where your most blatant day-to-day, moment-to-moment attachment is. Right here at the body. The least little thing happens to your body and you can't stand it. A little bit of hunger, a little bit of thirst, too much heat, too much cold sets you running off. A little bit of illness and you go running for medicine. If that's not attachment, what is? So it's important that we look right here. Otherwise we stay attached to the suffering the body is going to bring us. As we all know, it grows old, gets sick and then dies. If you don't think that's going to be suffering, then go spend some time with some very old people, some very sick people, with dying people. See how much they suffer. When I was back at my father's house 2 weeks ago, I helped every day with the daily ritual of turning him over, so my stepmother could take off his diaper. While she was doing that, I got to see what an old body with bed sores looks like, how an old body functions and doesn't function, how much suffering it brings when it's helpless, not only for the person in the old body, but also for the people taking care of him. I also saw what it's like to be old and not to have trained the mind. The mind at a time like that is totally out of control because as the body gets weaker, your energy falls. The thoughts that come barging into the mind can take total control if you haven't developed the ability to counter them. Then there are all the indignities of aging. It's as if the human body is designed to undercut any sense of pride we might feel. Other people have to wipe you, other people have to turn you over. Whatever sense of privacy you used to have about your body gets thrown out the window. You can't control your urinating, can't control your defecating. Everything goes out of control. And it's good to contemplate this, not to develop a sense of aversion, but to look at the universality of this bodily condition, and to develop a sense of samvega, seeing how much effort goes into maintaining the body and then where all that effort ends up. If that's where you're looking for happiness, you're looking in the wrong place. That's what this whole contemplation is about. If you don't learn how to give up your attachment now while you're still healthy and strong, it's going to get harder and harder as the body weakens, as the body grows old. So we have to develop a sense of passaddha, a sense of confidence in the contemplation of the body. There's no way you're going to get over your attachment to the body if you don't look at it very, very carefully. The reason we're attached is because we don't look carefully. This is what the contemplation of the 32 parts of the body is all about. Contemplating the body in terms of the elements, for that's all it is. What have you got here? Just physical elements. Wind, or energy. Fire, warmth. Water, coolness. And earth, solidity. Do they belong to you? No, they're all part of the world. As the saying goes, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. As long as we're alive, we take in the elements as we eat and we expel elements as we defecate, and then when we have to give the whole thing up, it all goes back into the elements as we die. So where are you going to find true happiness there? After all the effort that goes into the body, is the body true to you? Sometimes it does what you want, but a lot of times it doesn't. When it starts getting old and grows sick and dies, it doesn't ask your permission. You'd think that after all the effort you put into it, it would show some gratitude, but it can't. That's not its nature. We're the ones who have been animating this thing. One of the images in the canon is of the body as a puppet. We pull the strings for a while and then they snap, the pieces break down. It's good to develop a sense of dispassion and disenchantment for the body, to develop a sense of samvega, so that when it breaks down we don't break down, too. We chant the 32 parts of the body so often that the chant has become almost automatic. You can do it without even thinking about what you're saying, so stop and focus on each of the 32 parts, one by one. Stop and visualize each one as you go down the list. Start with hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth, skin, flesh. As you visualize each part, also try to have a sense of where exactly in your body the part is located. When you get to the skin, you realize you've got the whole body all surrounded right there. There's skin all around you, on all sides. Flesh is all over the place, with the bones at the core. Go through the various parts until you hit one that really strikes you, really hits home. Remind yourself, oh yeah, there's one of those in this body, too. And it really hits you how incongruous it is. You have a liver, a gallbladder, a large intestine, 24 hours out of the day. You've been carrying this thing around with you all the time, this thing being whichever part gives you a sense of how odd or disgusting or unclean or peculiar this body is, whichever part hits you in any way that's helpful for contemplating. Here you've been taking so much care of this, looking after it so much, and this is all you've got to show for all that effort. We're not bad-mouthing the body, we're just looking at it for what it is. Ultimately, we want to learn how to use it simply as a tool without attachment, but to counteract the attachment you've got to go very far in the other direction to counteract all the hype, all the slick advertising slogans you've used to sell yourself on the body. About how important it is, how essential it is. All the good things that come from looking after it very carefully, doing all the yoga, giving it exercise, eating all the right foods. You can do those things and yet still it's going to age, grow ill, and die. One of the meditation techniques Ajahn Fuang liked to teach when people developed a sense of light in the body was to have them visualize themselves within that light. Sometimes they didn't even have to will it. The image would appear on its own right there in the light. They could see themselves sitting right in front of themselves. Then he'd say, okay, think about what the body is going to look like 5 years from now, then 10 years, 15, 20, on up to when you die. What is it going to look like when you die? Then if you keep it around the second day after you die, the third day, fourth day, fifth day, what will it look like then? After 7 days, cremate it. Watch the cremation flames. And then what's left? Just some ashes and bones, and then over time the bones themselves will ultimately turn to ash. You've got nothing but a pile of powder. Then it gets blown away. Then he'd have them run the film backwards, reassemble the whole thing until you got back to the present moment to reconnect with the fact that what you've got right here is inevitably headed in the direction you just saw. The benefit of all this is that when there's the least little delusion about the body, this contemplation helps to cut right through it. Then the desire for an ideal body, any thought that other people may get old, but I'm going to do yoga, I'm going to eat right, and I'm not going to get old as fast as they do. You see how deluded and futile it is? This is not to encourage you not to take care of the body, but simply to watch out for any delusion that gets built up around it, so that when aging, illness, and death come you're more prepared. Another reason to contemplate it is to ask yourself, aging, illness, and death are coming, have you attained this state of mind that's going to be free from suffering when they arrive? If you haven't, how much time do you have? You don't know. So get to work right now. When the urge comes to cut short your meditation, remember this. How much more time will you have to meditate? Have you gotten to where you want to go? After all, this is the end of the storyline for all of us. Aging, illness, and death. This is where it's all headed. You've got to be prepared. Otherwise you'll lie in bed hallucinating when you get old, seeing strange dogs in the corner and people committing suicide out in the yard. Because the fact of your being old, the fact of your approaching death, is just too much for you to think about, too much for the mind to handle. The mind starts blocking things out. When it blocks things out in that way, it heads toward delusion. It tries to run away as much as it can from the unpleasant things, but you can't run away from them. They're right there. You have yourself trapped. The only way to get out of this trap is to dig down into the mind and uproot your attachments. That's where your hope lies. When the Buddha points out the negative side of things, it's never just to stop at the negative side. It's to point you toward the deathless. It's to remind you as a warning. This is the way things are, so what are you going to do to stay happy in the face of how they are? Only the deathless can give you a secure refuge at a time like that. We like to think that life will come to a nice point of closure where the loose ends get tied up, where everything gets settled, as at the end of a movie or a novel, but that's not what happens. Everything just unravels, falls apart. Things don't come back together and resolve themselves nicely. There's a huge dissonance at the end of life as things trail off every which way. That's how the body comes to an end. The question then is, will the mind go the same way as well? We have the choice. This is our opportunity, the practice, so we contemplate the unattractive side of the body to develop a sense of samvega, to encourage us to practice and dig deeper. As the Buddha said, mindfulness immersed in the body ultimately leads to the deathless if you do it right. If you do it wrong and develop a sense of aversion like the monks in the story, then as the Buddha advised them, go back to the breath. That will help dispel the aversion in the same way that the first rains of the rainy season dispel all the dust that has filled the air during the hot season. But that doesn't mean you stop doing contemplation of the body. It simply means you have to learn how to do it skillfully, so that the sense of samvega is always there, inspiring a sense of pasada in whatever way will give you some release, provide the escape, so that, as the sutta says, you'll be happy even when ill, happy even when aging, happy even when you die. But because our attachment to the body is so strong, we need strong medicine to counteract it. Body contemplation is not something you do once every now and then. It's something you have to do repeatedly. You have to keep coming back to this theme because it's the only thing that will keep you sane, the only thing that will provide real release. If you find yourself resisting this practice, look into that resistance to see exactly what it is. It's usually a disguise for your attachment. The body isn't the problem, the attachment is the problem, but to deal with the attachment, you've got to focus on the object where the attachment holds on very tight. When you really look at it, you see that the body's really not much, it's not worth much, and yet your attachment builds up so many narratives, so many desires around it. So this is a topic of meditation you need to have close at hand at all times, because these attachments come up in all kinds of ways at all times. You want to be ready for them, on top of them. As the body continues doing its thing, it wears down here, wears down there, this illness comes up, that illness comes up. You'll be prepared. In Thailand they have the tradition of printing books at funerals, and in the beginning of each book, there will usually be a little biography of the person to whom the merit is dedicated. A lot of the best Dhamma books in Thailand are the ones printed at funerals, so as you read these Dhamma books you can't help but look at some of the biographies. They all follow the same pattern. The person was doing well, had a happy life, wife, husband, children, whatever. Then after a while he or she started to develop a particular ailment, maybe a little bit of kidney problem, a liver problem, maybe a heart problem. At first it didn't seem too serious, the medicine took care of it, but after a while it became more and more chronic, more and more troublesome, ultimately to the point where doctors couldn't do anything. They just had to throw up their hands, and although they did their best, the person died. And it's ironic. The human mind has the tendency to think, well, that's them. Somehow I'm different. But you're not different. Look at yourself, look at all the people around you. What disease will strike down the person next to you? What disease will strike down that person over there? What disease do they already have inside them that's ultimately going to do that? What disease is inside you? The potential is already there, doing its work. One of the contemplations I'd frequently do in Bangkok, as I was riding a bus, would be to remind myself that all the people in the bus have a funeral ahead of them. There's going to be a funeral for this person, a funeral for that person, a funeral for that person over there. It'll hit all of them. And me, too. And it's funny. You might think that this sort of thinking is pessimistic or sad, but it's not. It's liberating. It's a great equalizer. You don't get tied up in the particulars of liking this person or not liking that person, being worried about this or that issue in your life. You know it's all going to end in death. And that thought frees you to focus on things that really are important, like the whole issue of attachment. Try to see this practice as liberating, because it is. If you appreciate that fact, you find you get more and more mileage out of it. If you have the right attitude toward contemplation of the body, it can take you far. It can provide a lot of freedom even in the midst of aging, illness, and death, in the midst of all the indignities and pains and problems of aging, illness, and death, for it helps point you in the right direction, to the part of the mind that is free. The last time I saw Ajahn Suwat, shortly before his death, he mentioned that his brain was beginning to malfunction, that it was giving him all sorts of weird perceptions. But he added, "That thing I got through the meditation, though. That hasn't changed, it's still there, which is why the suffering of the body didn't weigh on his mind, why the weird perceptions produced by the brain didn't deceive him. He showed that it's possible not to suffer in the process of growing ill and dying. And when something like that is possible, you really want to aim all of your efforts in that direction. As one of the chants says, don't be the sort of person who later regrets that you didn't take advantage of the opportunity to practice when you were still healthy and strong." Anger. August 28, 2003. The Buddha's basic teaching on insight is the Four Noble Truths. We tend to lose sight of that fact, thinking that insight means seeing the inconstancy, stress, and not selfness of things. It does in part, but that insight has to take place in a larger context, which is of the Four Noble Truths. And these truths in turn come down to cause and effect, skillful and unskillful. The things you do that lead to suffering and the things you can do that lead to the end of suffering. The doing there is important, because we shape our experience much more than we normally imagine, and insight lies in seeing precisely that fact. Seeing what we're doing to shape our experience, even though we may think we're sitting here perfectly still doing nothing at all. There's an undercurrent of sankhara, or fashioning, going on in the mind all the time, even now. Insight shows its usefulness in pointing out that we're doing this shaping, and also in showing us where we're doing it in unskillful ways, so that we can learn to do it more skillfully. Essentially, insight consists of catching yourself creating trouble, catching yourself creating stress, creating unnecessary burdens for yourself, seeing what you're doing as you actually do it, realizing that you chose to do it. Ajahn Vuang once said, insight comes down to seeing your own stupidity. You've been doing things that you don't have to do, that create suffering for you and the people around you. And even though these things cause suffering, you keep on doing them again and again and again. That's stupidity. We don't like to think of ourselves as stupid, but we are. When you finally develop the equanimity needed to admit your stupidity, when you can step back and learn how to unlearn all those stupid actions, that's where insight shows its benefits. It can teach you to fashion things in a new way, a better way, so that your participation in shaping your experience, your participation in the world around you, gets more and more skillful. If insight didn't help in these ways, it wouldn't really be worth much. There are lots of teachings about emptiness and inconstancy or impermanence that are wide of the mark. They may be interesting to reflect on, to speculate about, but if they don't make any difference in what you're actually doing from moment to moment, they're pretty useless. This is why the Buddha avoided many of the issues that everyone else in his time was worked up about. Is everything a oneness? A plurality? Is the body the same as the life force? Is the body different from the life force? Is the world eternal? Is it not eternal? Is it finite? Is it infinite? When people reach the end of the path, do they exist, not exist, both, neither? These were the hot philosophical issues of the day, but the Buddha refused to get involved in them because they didn't make any difference in terms of this one issue. What are you doing that's skillful and unskillful? Can you learn to act more skillfully than you've been doing? A lay follower of the Buddha was once approached by a person who asked just these questions. What does your teacher teach? Does he teach that the world is finite or infinite? And the lay follower said, well, no. Eternal, not eternal? No, he doesn't address that issue either, and so on down the list. And the first person complained, well, your teacher doesn't seem to teach anything at all. So the lay follower said, that's not the case. He teaches what's skillful and what's unskillful. Remember that. That's the most basic issue the Buddha addresses, and he addresses it in a lot of detail. If meditation were simply a matter of learning how to get very still in the present moment, how do you think all of those different Dhamma teachings would have developed? All of what they call the 84,000 different division of the Dhamma in the canon came from someone who was really focused on the issue of skill and lack of skill, trying to develop more skillful ways of approaching everything in life. This is how your daily practice intersects with your meditation practice. Just try to be more skillful in what you say, more skillful in what you do. Develop that habit of being very clear about what your intentions are, very clear about what your actions are, and about the results. When you develop that attitude in your external actions and then bring it into your meditation, you get more skillful in what you think. You start seeing things you didn't see before. At the same time, as you develop in your meditation, you get more sensitive to your external actions as well. So in this way, your practice of sitting still with your eyes closed and your practice of walking around with your eyes open, out dealing with people in the world, become more of a whole. You're tackling the issue of skillfulness on all fronts. Make this the thread connecting everything you do as you practice. This is the thread that turns daily life into a genuine practice of daily life. Your interaction with other people then actually does become part of your practice. The work you do becomes part of your practice. Everything you do and say and think can become part of your practice if you approach every activity with the question, what's skillful here? What's not skillful here? What choices do I have? Take advantage of the freedom that every moment offers to make the best choice possible. When issues come up in daily life, try to approach them as a challenge in this way. When issues like lust, anger, or fear arise in the mind, take the opportunity to approach them skillfully. All too often we're afraid of fear, angry about our anger, lustful for our lust. In other words, we approach these unskillful mental states in unskillful ways that simply compound the problem. So the issue lies in learning how not to be angry about your anger, how not to be lustful for your lust, how not to be afraid of your fear. That way you can deal with these issues in a more effective, more harmless way. For example, anger. Frequently we've heard, and it's constantly repeated, that the antidote for anger is metta, or goodwill. In the canon, though, the Buddha actually offers a wide range of approaches for dealing with anger. In a few cases, he advocates developing metta for people who are harming you, but more generally he cites all four sublime attitudes as antidotes to anger. In other words, the antidote includes metta but not just metta. You want to develop the other sublime attitudes, too. And the attitude the Buddha recommends most is equanimity. Equanimity in the sense of stepping back from the situation and seeing it as part of a universal pattern, not just as something personal between you and the person you're angry with. One of the traditional ways to develop equanimity is to contemplate the principle of karma. That what you do is important. Particularly, in the situation in which you find yourself, what's important is not so much what the other person is doing as what you're doing. Focus on that. If you let yourself get worked up about what the other person is doing, how often he's done it, and how he's come back with it again and again and again and again. If you carry that thought around, you make it more and more difficult to deal with your response in the present moment. So, drop any thinking about what the other person has been doing, and turn around to look at what you've been doing and are about to do. To do this, it's useful to divide the anger into 3 parts. 1. The object of the anger. 2. The anger itself as a mental state. And 3. The physical manifestations of the anger. When you can separate them out in this way, anger becomes a lot easier to deal with. To separate the anger itself from the object of the anger, you step back and think in terms of equanimity. Here the Buddha recommends looking at the universality of your problem. In one sutta he divides up the reasons for being angry and sets them out in kind of a chart. One reason for being angry is that this person has done something harmful to me. Or this person has done something harmful to people I love, or this person has done something helpful to people I don't like at all. In each case you're supposed to reflect, well, what should I expect? It's the way of the world. That question, what should I expect? Asked with a cynical tone of voice, is meant to pull you back a little bit, to get you to see the situation in a larger context. Then you go on to, this person is doing something harmful to me, this person is doing something harmful to people I like, or this person is doing something helpful to people I don't like. In other words, you bring the whole set from the past into the present tense, and again the question is, what should I expect? The next set of 3 puts all 3 variables into the future. This person is going to do something harmful to me, and on down the line. When you stop to think like that, the simple act of stepping back from the situation and putting it into a larger framework can provide you with some perspective. In other words, you reflect on the ways of the world. This is a world of friends and enemies, where any action is bound to displease somebody. This is the kind of world you were born into, and you were the one who wanted to be born here. This is the way things are everywhere in this world. A lot of wisdom lies just in being able to step back and remember that fact. Look at the situation in terms of a larger framework, so that your thoughts aren't focused with such narrow intensity on the person or the activity you don't like. When they're narrowly focused like that, the huge blind spots around them make us lose our perspective not only about what's happening, but also about what we should be doing. Often what gets shunted off to the side when we're angry is the sense of shame and the sense of fear for the consequences of our actions. People can get extremely courageous in dumb ways when they're angry, because their fear of consequences gets shoved off to the side, like a poor relative or an unwanted child. So the first step is to take that larger viewpoint, to see the situation in a larger framework, so as to eliminate the blind spots. Within that framework, your anger becomes something you obviously don't want to follow through with. You don't want it to influence your actions. If you know that you're the heir of your actions, you don't want to inherit any actions done with an unskillful state of mind. The function of equanimity is to remind you of that fact. That's when you can drop your focus on the object of the anger and turn to look at the anger itself in the mind. Here the problem is complicated by the fact that anger is usually accompanied by a physical reaction. When a flash of anger bursts into the mind, it really sets our bloodstream churning. All sorts of hormones come roaring out. Our heart beats wildly, we breathe in a different way, and an oppressive sense of tension or discomfort develops in the body. Our immediate reaction is that we'd like to get that discomfort out of our system. But if we try to get it out of our system in the usual way, which is speaking or acting under the force of the anger, that just compounds the problem. Also, the physical reaction confuses us. Sometimes we can actually think ourselves into a better perspective about the anger, but the bloodstream is still churning, and it makes us think we must still be angry. That churning of the bloodstream can last a long time. After all, our bodies are built for the fight or flight response, and we normally need more than just a few seconds if we're going to fight, more than a few seconds if we're going to flee. In cases like that, those long-lasting hormones are useful. But when you're trying to overcome the anger in the mind, the lastingness of those hormones is not helpful at all. So make sure to see the thoughts and the physical symptoms as 2 separate things. The mind itself may have calmed down somewhat from the anger, but the physical manifestations are still present, obstructing your view of the mind, so you want to deal with them. Breathe through the tension. Breathe in a way that gets your heartbeat back to normal. Breathe in a way that gets the level of tension in your body back to normal. You might want to think of the tension in your body as flowing out your feet, out your hands, all through the in-breath, all through the out. Open up those energy channels so that you're not carrying this sense of oppression around. That makes the anger a lot easier to deal with because you feel less burdened, less irritated, less constricted physically. Then you can look at the mind in and of itself. What is the state of anger in and of itself? As I said, it's often a blinding of the mind, putting blinders on the sides of your mental eyes so you can see only certain things and focus only on certain details. The state of being constricted mentally like this is really unpleasant. Just stepping back to look at it helps take off some of those blinders. You don't have to be afraid of the anger or angry about the anger. Just ask, what is this state, to be angry? Taking a look at it begins to open things up inside. But again, your looking has to come from the larger perspective that helps you see through the anger, helps you disidentify with the anger. The anger may still be there in the mind, but you don't have to identify with it. You can see it as a separate mental event. That's important because you then realize that there are parts of the mind that really aren't angry, that aren't involved in the anger at all. The anger seemed to consume the mind, but that's just because it narrowed your perception of the mind's full range. So as you open things up like this, you can help weaken the anger, weaken the hold of the anger on your mind. When you develop a larger perspective, you can step back and see what really should be done. What's the most skillful thing to say here? What are my opportunities? What are the choices available to me? If you have a broader viewpoint, then it's easier to see the choices than you could have when the blinders were on. Then you can see what really would be appropriate. You can see. If you were to say what you feel so much like saying, what would the results really be? As the Buddha points out, many of the things we want to do under the force of anger are precisely the things our enemies would like to see us do. Destroying our good looks, destroying our property, destroying our friendships, doing things that will get us punished. Do you want to please your enemy that way? If you look dispassionately at the actions you wanted to do and can see that the results wouldn't be good, remind yourself, I don't want that. Maybe this is not the best time or place to say anything at all. Maybe I should wait for circumstances to change. Because you've breathed through the physical side of the anger, you find it a lot easier to delay your actions to a more appropriate time, because you don't feel the compulsion of bottled up frustration. Or, if it so happens that something should be done right away, the fact that you've broadened your perspective helps you to see better alternatives. Better things to do, better things to say right away. So remember this as an appropriate antidote to the normal way of reacting to anger. Too often when we're angry about what someone has done, we're either angry at the person or we turn around and get angry at ourselves for the anger, neither of which really is very helpful. Instead, we should step back to see the actions of that other person in context. After all, this is the way the world is. That helps you to react in a more skillful way. When we talk about the limitations of the world, it sometimes seems very confining and depressing, but it's not. Actually, to think about these things is a very liberating teaching. There's no way you're going to make the world perfect, so you don't have to make the world perfect. That takes a huge burden off the mind right there. You simply think of what should be done right now in this particular set of circumstances, given the larger perspective, looking at the world as a whole, looking at human nature, looking at the whole human enterprise. You view your interaction with other people within the context of a much larger perspective. These are the ways of the world. Of course, it's going to be imperfect. What did you expect, given the fact that the world is imperfect? Given the reality of the situation, what are you going to do right now to respond in the most skillful way? This way you find that, of the lessons from the meditation, this quest for skillfulness is precisely the lesson that translates best into daily life, as you deal with lust, anger, fear, as you deal with all of the imperfect situations in the world. You see that they're imperfect, and yet you try to find a skillful response. This quest for skillfulness requires that you use your imagination. That's what the larger perspective is for. It opens up more possibilities to your imagination so that your old habits don't form ruts that you can never get out of. You think of new ways of responding, unexpected ways of responding. This is where insight really opens up new possibilities in your life, where it shows its true worth. The ability to see the movements of the mind minutely is an important insight only if it makes you more skillful in the way you act and speak and think. So keep that perspective in mind. Keep that quest for skillfulness in mind as well, so that your actions really do fall into the path that leads to the end of suffering, and don't keep falling into the path that leads to more and more compounded suffering again and again and again. This is where the meditation shows its true value in our lives, even if we don't get all the way to the ultimate skill of reaching the deathless. The fact that we've trained ourselves to be more and more skillful leads the mind in the direction of less and less suffering. It inclines the mind in that direction. If you don't make it all the way to the deathless in this lifetime, your quest for skillfulness ensures that your next lifetime will keep heading in that direction. You build up a momentum. So do your best to head your mind in that direction, because otherwise this samsara, this wandering around that we keep doing, is pretty aimless. The image the Buddha gives is of throwing a stick up in the air. Sometimes it falls on this end, sometimes it falls on the other end, sometimes it falls flat on its side. All pretty random, aimless. Try to turn your life from a stick thrown up into the air into an arrow flying straight in a particular direction, toward more and more skillfulness. Ultimately, someday, whether in this lifetime or the next, that arrow will reach its target, but only if you focus on this issue of skillfulness right here and right now. And keep it right here right now, every right here and right now. That's what builds up the momentum. That's what gives direction and meaning to life. This is the end of this episode. We will seeing you on our next episode. In accordance with the Buddha's guidance, we stress the significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page book into an easily accessible audio format. It's now your turn to contribute to this noble cause. By subscribing, liking, and sharing this content, you actively participate in the spread of these teachings for the benefit of others. Together, we uphold the tradition of sharing knowledge and mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. Join us in this endeavor, and collectively, we can bring about a profound impact in the lives of many.